Sometimes, history forgets the people who mattered the most. Not the kings, not the conquerors, but the little girls, the ones who were never supposed to matter. The ones who were traded like property, used like currency, and buried in silence. This is the story of one of those girls. Her name was Margaret Beaufort, and she was just 12 years old when her life was taken from her, not by death, but by duty. Before we dive into this hidden world, I want to know something first. Where in the world are you watching from? Tell me your city or country in the comments below. It honestly amazes me how we can explore the past together, even if we're miles or continents apart. And hey, if you love stories that bring history to life, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, we've got so many more unbelievable stories coming your way. She was born on May 31, 1443, at Bletsoe Castle in England. From the moment she arrived in this world, Margaret wasn't treated like a child. She was treated like an asset, a little girl wrapped in noble blood, money, and ambition. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, was a powerful man, but that power came at a cost. Just a year after Margaret's birth, her father died, possibly by suicide. And in medieval England, suicide wasn't just a tragedy. It was a sin, one that cursed your family name. That moment changed everything for Margaret. She didn't just lose a father. She lost protection. Suddenly, this tiny girl, still learning to walk, became one of the richest heiresses in the country, which meant the vultures came flying. While other little girls were learning rhymes or playing in the fields, Margaret was being evaluated. Her dowry, her lands, her womb, everything about her was valuable to the men who circled around her. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, tried to shield her. She gave her a good education, taught her French, raised her with care. Maybe, just maybe, she hoped her daughter would grow up free. But England wasn't built for girls like Margaret to be free. At just 3 years old, King Henry VI handed her over like a prize to one of his most loyal nobles, William de la Pole, the Duke of Suffolk. And Suffolk had plans. He married this toddler, yes, toddler, to his 7-year-old son, John. Let that sink in. A 3-year-old girl was married. And even though the church gave their permission, even though everyone smiled, and nodded, and called it an alliance, deep down, they knew it was wrong. But in those halls of power, being wrong never stopped anyone. By the time Margaret was 10, her first husband was irrelevant. William de la Pole had fallen from grace, and been murdered. And Margaret, she was back on the political chessboard. That's when the king made the decision that would change her life forever. He handed her over to his half-brother, Edmund Tudor. Let's pause here for a second. At this point, Margaret is 12 years old, not a teenager, not a young woman, a child. Edmund Tudor, he was 24, twice her age, a grown man with ambition burning in his chest. And when he looked at Margaret, he didn't see a child who still clutched dolls at night. He saw an opportunity. The two were married in November 1455. Now, even in medieval England, where child marriages were technically allowed, there was an understanding. You did not consummate the marriage until the girl was older. At least 14, maybe even later. Why? Because everyone knew that pregnancy could kill a young girl. But Edmund didn't wait. Whether it was the night of the wedding, or shortly after, he forced himself on her. And I'm not saying that for drama. I'm saying it because it's the truth. A 24-year-old man had sex with a 12-year-old girl. It wasn't love. It wasn't romance. It was rape, plain and simple. And he did it for one reason: greed. Because under the law, if a wife died without children, her fortune went back to her family. But if she died after giving birth, her husband kept everything. So Edmund took a chance. A horrific, cold-blooded chance. And soon, Margaret was pregnant. Still just 12 years old, carrying the child of a man who didn't care if it killed her. Margaret was still just 12, when her belly began to swell. Imagine that. She probably didn't even fully understand what was happening to her body. Morning sickness, fatigue, strange pains, not the normal aches of growing up, but the signs of something far more terrifying. She wasn't ready. Physically, emotionally, mentally, in every possible way. She was still a child. And yet, she was expected to carry and deliver a child of her own. In July 1456, her husband Edmund was captured by Yorkist forces during one of the many battles in the Wars of the Roses. They imprisoned him. And by November, on the first anniversary of their marriage, he was dead. Officially, it was plague. Unofficially, Some whispered other possibilities. Margaret was 13 years old, 7 months pregnant, and now, completely alone. She could have stayed where she was, but she didn't. That moment right there is when something changed in her. Despite the bitter cold, the danger of war, and her fragile condition, Margaret decided to travel. She made her way to Pembroke Castle, seeking protection under her brother-in-law Jasper Tudor. That journey alone could have killed her. But she made it. And that's where the real ordeal began. On January 28, 1457, labor started. Now let me paint the picture for you. Margaret was always described as small, delicate, even her hips hadn't widened. Her body was still growing. She hadn't yet become a woman, biologically or emotionally. And yet, there she was, in labor. The baby was stuck. Midwives tried everything, but they weren't delivering a grown woman's child. They were trying to save a baby from inside a girl who had never stood a chance. Hours passed, then more. Screams echoed through the castle halls. The pain tore through Margaret's tiny frame. And when the baby was finally born, somehow, miraculously, both Margaret and the child survived. They named him Henry. That baby would grow up to become King Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. But survival came with a cost. Margaret's body was ruined. She would never have another child. Despite marrying again twice, she remained a mother to only one. Now think about that. In a time where noble women were expected to have a dozen children or more, Margaret had just one. That's how badly her body had been damaged. Later in life, her confessor, Bishop John Fisher, would say it was a miracle that a baby could be born of so little a personage. Even decades later, people remembered that birth as something almost supernatural, because no one had expected either of them to live. And yet, she did live. But she was never the same. The trauma was physical, yes, but it also carved something deep into her soul. She had been violated, widowed, isolated, and nearly killed, all before her 14th birthday. And yet, from that suffering, something cold and powerful began to grow. Her relationship with Henry would become obsessive. Some historians believe it was trauma, the fear of losing him, the guilt of how he was born, the need to protect the only child she would ever have. And she protected him with a kind of steel-hearted determination the world hadn't seen from a woman in her time. But that's the strange and tragic truth of Margaret Beaufort. The very thing that nearly destroyed her became the thing that gave her power. She would never forget that room. The stone walls. The screams. The moment her life was torn apart to give England a king. And in the years to come, she would wield that trauma like a weapon. Not with swords or armies, but with strategy, with silence. With survival. Margaret's trauma didn't end with childbirth. It became the shadow that followed her for the rest of her life. But it also became her armor. After the death of Edmund Tudor, Margaret remarried twice, first to Sir Henry Stafford, and then later to Thomas Stanley, a powerful noble, who would eventually become the Earl of Derby. But these marriages were strategic, not romantic. They gave her protection, and later, influence. Her entire existence revolved around her son. Henry was taken from her for safety reasons during the Wars of the Roses, and sent into exile. Margaret couldn't raise him herself, but she never stopped fighting for his future. She navigated a dangerous, chaotic political world with precision. The Yorkists ruled England, but Margaret, a Lancastrian by birth, played the long game, quietly, patiently, calculating every move. She made alliances, she gathered support, and when the time was right, she helped orchestrate Henry's return to England. In 1485, after years of war and uncertainty, Henry defeated King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. He took the throne as King Henry VII. And Margaret Beaufort became the king's mother, the matriarch of a new royal dynasty. But here's the thing, she wasn't just the king's mother. She signed her letters Margaret R.R. for Regina, the Latin word for queen. Even though she was never crowned, even though she never officially ruled, she behaved like a queen, in every way that mattered. She controlled access to her son. She managed her estates like a ruler. She founded colleges at Cambridge, including Christ's College and St. John's College, which still honor her today. She was a patron of religion, education, and the arts. But more than that, she was a political mastermind. And yet, despite all the wealth, the titles, the admiration, Margaret never had another child. Her body never healed. The screams from that night in Pembroke Castle never really faded. In her final years, Something heartbreaking happened that shows how deeply her past haunted her. Her granddaughter, also named Margaret Tudor, was betrothed to the King of Scotland at the age of 13, and Margaret Beaufort tried to stop it. She and her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York, begged King Henry VIII not to send the girl. They said the King of Scots wouldn't wait, that he'd hurt her, that it would ruin her health. Margaret knew exactly what would happen. She had lived it. But politics won again, just like it had when she was 12. And that's the cruelest part of this story. Even the most powerful woman in England couldn't save her granddaughter from the same fate that had nearly killed her. Margaret Beaufort died on June 29, 1509, just 5 days after her 66th birthday. She had outlived 4 husbands. She had seen her son become king, and her grandson inherit the throne. She had helped shape the Tudor dynasty, one of the most iconic eras in English history. But beneath all that power was still the girl who had been forced to give birth alone, at 13. The Tudor dynasty, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, all the drama, glory, and bloodshed, it all began with Margaret. A girl who was never supposed to matter. A child who was almost destroyed before she ever had a chance to live. And that's the part of the story we forget when we romanticize royal history. We forget that the throne was built on her broken body. Her legacy isn't just in her bloodline, it's in her survival. In the way she used pain to shape power. In the way she turned trauma into purpose. And maybe, just maybe, by remembering her truth, not just the crown and colleges, but the screams, the scars, and the silence, we can finally give Margaret Beaufort the one thing she was never given as a child, a choice. She was 12 years old, and that should have been enough to save her.